Alright, we played around with secondary designs and new ships. It's time to get to the USS Enterprise, the Constitution class, as seen in Discovery. Misha here, and this ship definitely deserves its own video by itself, but it'll be joined by its other 1701 brethren. We're going to see if it fits or is completely out of place. So, yeah, buckle up. This could be a long one. And here we are with the disco prize on the spinny thing. And we'll get to, is it a refit, is it canon, is it not canon, all that in a bit. But let's talk about the in-universe Constitution class. Although originally, as I'm sure you know, it was originally just kind of called the Starship class, which is a bit interesting. And just because it was nearby, I grabbed this one. This is something that really needs to be canon. The Refit NX, drawing it closer to a Connie. Oh boy, did they do. They did such a good job with this, both in the design and the model. And it really brings everything together. Still looking more primitive, but kind of establishing the Enterprise look. And this was an experimental and exploration vessel. Of course, the NX could fight if necessary, but that wasn't its goal. United Earth, later Starfleet, later the Federation kept other ships in Sol system and the Vulcan and Andorian systems for defense and other purposes. No, these were to boldly go, and that was the whole point behind the Constitution class. And it's an older class than you might think. People, I think, view this as the bleeding edge of technology, the newest, bestest thing in Starfleet in the 2260s. Actually, this was kind of the Excelsior of its day. People wonder why we see Excelsiors for so long and why there are so few, if any, Constitutions, even refits, in the TNG era. And that's because by that time, this was super old. Actually, the first Connies were planned out in the early 23rd century, and the maiden ship, the ship class setter, the USS Constitution, was laid down in the mid-2220s and was launched, commissioned by at least 2230. Now, it's unclear if it was in CC 1700, with the Enterprise being literally the next one built at 1701, or otherwise. We'll get into the whole naming thing a bit here, the number thing. But we do know for a fact that the Enterprise herself was commissioned and launched. And there is a difference, I know, between commissioning and launching, at least in the real world. I don't know if in Star Trek it holds. But that was in 2245. And from the very beginning, this was a deep space exploration vessel intended for 5-year voyages. So typically you'll have captaincies of 5 years. Initially you had Robert April from 2245 to 2250. That's a hell of a shakedown cruise. And then Pike took over in 2250, and he would actually helm the ship for 3 5-year missions, with his final one concluding in 2265. By the way, Spock joined his crew in 2254. So Spock had been on board a little while too. Of course, in 2265, it was handed over to Kirk, who saw it through its next 5-year mission, concluding in 2270. At the end of its mission there, it was severely damaged, went back to base for refit, and that's where we get the motion picture era, which is supposed to be the same ship, but really can't be. We'll talk about that later too. And then presumably we'll have another 5-year mission, 2270 to 2275. And this seems to be about when things time out. There could have been yet another one between 75 and 80, but we do know by the era of Wrath of Khan, 2284, 2285, it was hanging around Earth, essentially being a training vessel. And even though in Star Trek 3, the Fleet Admiral says that it's 20 years old, this is patently incorrect, even by very strict on-canon things. The Enterprise herself is 40 years old, at least if we consider it's the same ship. And the class is approaching 60 years old, especially if you consider design phase. It even might date back to the 70s. So these were not new. That doesn't mean they're bad. They were designed for a very specific role and mission, and were just a esteemed post, kind of at the forefront, and kind of following on the tradition of the NX class and the Daedalus classes and all of those. They weren't necessarily the biggest or the most powerful, but in some ways they were the most well-rounded and most independent vessels in the fleet. Whereas other ships could go to space dock or starbase, or even just other planets, colonies, to resupply and repair. So, every few weeks or months or even a year, these were expected to be able to at least make it 5 years without that, and maybe longer. So that kind of, the different mission profile really did change things a lot. The Constitution class had between 21 and 22 decks, depending on the source. That's a close enough number that I don't really feel there's a true discrepancy. I'm sure one deck could be knocked in or out, like down in the secondary hull. We do know that originally engineering was down around deck 17, and the main cargo hold and shuttle bay, deck 18. Bridge on deck 1. The VIP quarters, deck 4. Officers' quarters, including the staterooms for the high-ranking officers, were on deck 5. And crewmen were lower, either sharing quarters or even being housed in barracks. And the staterooms were pretty good. They're kind of a nice, kind of European hotel style with, a total of 3 rooms, a sleeping area / kind of couch entertainment area, and then more of a work lounge entertainment area with a desk, computer screen, and a dining nook, plus a 3rd room acting as a bedroom, or fresher as they sometimes call them. And if you go down to more of a junior officer's quarters, they would usually lose a few amenities, including the dining nook, and the bedroom would become a little more stark. But the rooms were configurable. You could, because they were essentially divided by a partition that could be opened or closed or moved, or, not a bad idea. And the barracks are exactly as you would expect. But don't fear, they had all kinds of stuff on board. They had recreation rooms. They had a bowling alley, arboretum, probably a swimming pool. Hey, if the TARDIS had a swimming pool, why not? So they were set up for long duration inhabitants for their mission. They were relatively fast for their day and time. Max warp of 8. Cruise warp of between 2 and 6, depending on the economy level. But it does get a little weird with the original series, because we see it going at warp 11, even warp 14, which, according to Voyager, if 10 makes you a salamander, what would 11 or 14 make you? Anyway, it has phaser banks. We don't always know exactly how many, but multiple. Usually there's said to be 1 on the secondary hull pointing rear, and 2 to 6 pointing forward on the saucer. We do know, with some reasonable confidence, that it has a total of 6 photon torpedo tubes, but these seem to be single-shot tubes, and it does actually carry a lot of photon torpedoes, up to 400. However, photons of the 2250s and 2260s seem to be smaller and less punchy than what we see later. It seems like much as the phasers get upped in the TMP era, photons did too. I'm not talking about crew and length because that's actually debatable. And I don't mean just because of Discovery or JJ. I mean going back to the 1960s. Nevertheless, what's not debated is the long-range mission and the independence of this class and just kind of the esteem of this class. It's the original, and of course throughout the original series in the 60s, it's the only Starfleet ship we see because it's the only model they had for that. In TOS Remastered, we do get a couple others, which is nice, but they're always very secondary ships, and they're not ship-of-the-line types. They're freighters and surveyors and stuff. So, let's get a little more into the Discovery ship here and talk about all the interesting inconsistencies and changes done to the Connie and the Enterprise herself over the years. Alright, setting the Disco Prize back for a second. Here are three. This is the Cage version. This is the Mirror Universe version. And this is either the Enterprise or the Yorktown, either way, the standard show configured version from the 60s. I'm not sure which it is because the difference is only in the name on the ship. That's okay though, because even Roddenberry wasn't sure. Originally he wanted to name it Yorktown. As you know, it became Enterprise. Same thing with the captain. First April, then Pike, then Kirk. Heck, there was even a time when he wanted to name the captain Winters. Yeah. And the shooting model would change. Now here we have what Eagle Moss calls the Cage version. It's not perfect though. In the positive, it has the enlarged original size deflector, although I'm pretty confident in saying that was originally meant to be a communications array. And it does have the original style nacelles with the spikes on the Bussard collectors and the kind of flat end cap pieces. What it lacks is the proper larger scale bridge module. Now in the real world, the reason the bottom section here is plastic, so they could make a new mold. The top, the saucer is metal. To make a new die-cast mold of that would have probably been too cost prohibitive for a bonus special edition. Here we have the Mirror Universe version, and the reason I brought this out, sorry to rock you there, this was seen in the original series and was retained for TOS Remastered. It has the spikes on the Bussard collectors and the flat rear to the nacelles, or an angled rear, I guess you would say. But it has the smaller deflector and the smaller bridge dome. Now this was essentially the version used in the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, except I don't think that pilot version had the spikes. Anyway, the standard series version had a couple of other minor changes. Smaller bridge, smaller deflector, definitely no spikes, and they put these ball caps on the end of the nacelles. Also, throughout the whole process, they were adding a few more lights and a few more details, as you'd expect. But those are the big changes. So why? What was the idea behind all this? Aside from just making the model better, it's because they didn't know the size. Originally, in '64, Roddenberry said this could be 200 feet, which is 61 meters, and wanted to give it a crew of 200-ish. And this is confirmed by the cage, where the crew is mentioned explicitly by Pike. But when Matt Jeffries got his way, came on board and had a more technical background, he calculated a length, a size of about 900 feet. And so originally that was about 274 meters. It was never made Canon official, but 900 feet, give or take, was used for a long time. An alternative length early on was about 289 meters. Not a big difference, but 15 meters is 15 meters. And by this point in the series, we have a crew that went from 200 plus to about 430. So that's actually why the deflector was made smaller and the bridge was made smaller. They didn't have money to remake the entire studio model, but they thought by making changes like that, it would alter the scale kind of in mind on screen, changing easily identifiable parts. Keep in mind these were originally viewed on black and white TV, later color, but still very small TVs. So yeah, and that actually comes to the NCC 1701. That was just essentially a registry number Jeffries made up. NCC, as he credits, was a combination of U.S. Naval Code and Aircraft Code and Soviet Code, essentially made up. And he picked 7 and 1 and 0 as numbers because they could be easily seen on TV screens and not mistaken. His idea was just to look good. Later, the idea kind of in universe was floated about that the Enterprise was the first in the 17th major iteration of a starship. So there had been 16 previous classes or types, and the Enterprise was 17, which actually kind of gels with some of the stuff we see in Discovery, with experimental ships being 10 and science exploration ships being 14, NCC 14 something, and more combat support type ships being 16 something. And that would still leave your explorers, your Constitutions, being 17. And they did not mass produce these. These were expensive. And originally they only made the Constitution and either 12 or 14 sister ships, although later this would expand out. But yeah, early on they couldn't even settle on a crew or length, and with the motion picture things would just get more colorful. So the original series was canceled and we move into the 70s. We do have the animated series, which introduces a couple of changes, including sometimes showing 2 turbo lifts for the bridge, which would require a kind of redesign of the top module a little bit. And of course then we get into Phase 2, Planet of the Titans, and the TMP era. And what we start to see is Matt Jeffries is getting replaced by newer people, including Andrew Probert. And we see certain trends here, beginning with this Phase 2. Even though this was never seen in the series itself, the depiction is on graphics and all that. It pops up quite a bit. And what we see are thicker, angled back nacelle pylons and these more squarey nacelles. And like I said, we see a bridge module with 2 turbo lifts. But we still have, on this at least, more or less old school style deflector. And the engineering hull is, yeah. Now this Eagle Moss model is nice, but it's not perfect, so don't take it as gospel. But I do want to point out these struts. You know, with a line in the middle. Well, Planet of the Titans Phase 2 did not happen, but we did get the motion picture, which, while maybe not everyone's favorite, did lead to very good things, and it led to probably one of the best models we've ever had in Star Trek. We have a slightly slimmer pylon, but still very flared, and it does have kind of the ridge in the middle. The now iconic TMP nacelles, and the now iconic concave glowy bit. And this, by this point, is definitely a deflector. And a redesign. Here's the thing. The TMP is supposed to be a refit, meaning same ship. And refits can get pretty extensive. But maybe not this extensive, because the truth is the shape of the saucer and the secondary hull is different. And that would be very hard to do. Replacing the nacelles and pylons and deflector, sure, modular. Bridge, sure, modular. And also the size is slightly scaled up. Probert kind of felt like it needed to be a little bigger, so started working with 1,000 feet rule of thumb. So that gets us about 300 meters, and that seems to get expanded out to about 305 sometimes too. Not a big difference, and part of it could be explained by sweeping back the nacelles versus straight. And part of it is just the redesign of the saucer and everything. And these are still long range. And this would be the version we would see throughout the movies. And funnily enough, we would see several different bridge styles too. Star Trek 1, 2, 3, 4, the bridge didn't change too much, but 5 it changed a lot, and then 6 it changed again. That's frankly okay. But we start to see that this is supposed to be the same ship, refit or not. That might be a little hard to justify, especially with the original length being as small as 61 meters, then 274, then 289, then 300, then 305. It was never really made canon, at least not until the late 80s, early 90s. And of course, different people had different ideas. Roddenberry, Jeffries, Probert. Who's right? It's fiction, so no one's wrong, no one's right. And that kind of gets us to the modern era. Never mind, okay, objectively, sometimes some people and some designs are wrong. Let's just be frank with ourselves. From the dates to the sizes to the technology to the look, these don't work, especially this one. But even this one isn't fantastic. So with the longest prologue ever out of the way, what about the actual Discovery Enterprise here? Does it work? Does it not? Could it be the same ship? Objectively, just talking about the model here, it's pretty light. Like most of the Enterprises, the saucer's metal, the star drive is plastic. By the way, originally, the idea was saucer separation. Actually, early on, the idea was perhaps the saucer would detach pretty routinely to explore solar systems, and then rejoining with what they called the galaxy drive to go long distances. This was supposed to house the warp systems, or time warp as they called it originally, and that's when the dish was maybe more for long-range communications than anything else. Of course, while that was always an option, even into the motion picture era, it was never utilized. But it does kind of explain the shape and ideas and why so many of the systems are in the saucer on the Constitution class. We're pretty close to what we see. It does have kind of the flat back ends to the nacelles like the cage version, but it does not have the spikes. That's okay though, because we see this a couple of years after the cage. And we do have pretty standard looking deflector. And we do have a bridge with one visible turbo lift shaft, not two. But of course we have lots of little changes, including, to the impulse engines here, and the shuttle bay having this kind of small runway on it, which I actually like. I don't know why. It kind of seems practical to have a workspace outside your shuttle bay. I can see lots of uses for that. It's also something that could be easily added or removed, or you could actually extend the shuttle bay back to make more room inside it if you start to use larger shuttles later. I could see that. And I do find it interesting with the swept-back pylons. They're a little more flared. I'd almost like them more straight, but they are very reminiscent of the movie and the Phase 2. Almost as if the Enterprise was always meant to have those styles of pylons, not to mention added hull plating and details and all of that good stuff. So what about the size? Well, this is actually what started me dividing the Discovery sizes by 2/3, because the stated size is 442 meters. And if you divide it, that gets you about 294 meters, which is literally right in the middle between the TOS Constitution and the TMP Constitution, meaning that works fine. And at that size, yeah. And that's really the only major problem with this, is if it were 442 meters, and that means retroactively the Constitution was always 442 meters. Which then kind of throws off things like decks and all of that, because usually the decks are between 3 and 4 meters each and all that good stuff. By the way, in the TMP era, they went away from the 6 single-shot photon tubes to 4 multi-shot tubes, which is actually kind of like a lot of U.S. warships, and Japanese especially, did between World War I and World War II with torpedoes. They had larger single-shot. They went to multiple magazine shot torpedo tubes, but they also had more powerful torpedoes and fewer of them on board. So by the TMP era, these were carrying only 144 torpedoes, but they were seen on screen to be much, much more powerful. In fact, if you remember in Star Trek VI, we see a torpedo punching clean through the saucer. A lot more powerful than what we see in the TOS era. So what do you think? Do these fit? Do these work? What's going on? Okay, compared to this, the Discovery is goddamn gorgeous. Yeah. And here, you're only making things slightly better. You improve the pylons a bit, but then you put them in a weird place, and you put the nacelles right up against each other. Yeah, just stop. Well, I think they technically did, because it's been 6 years and no new films. So this is what we've got now. How does it kind of compare to the originals? Could the cage version be turned into this and then later turned into this? Well, frankly, if we just kind of square up on the overall size, yeah, I think so. Bridges could be replaced, nacelles and pylons, and even, like I said, the shuttle bay. They could either remove this or just extend the whole shuttle bay back to make room for the larger Class Fs versus the Cs in use at the time. Now the fact is, would they? Because this kind of looks more, more advanced than the 60s. Yeah, frankly, probably not. And you know what? Frankly, that's also okay. And you know who would agree? Gene Roddenberry. His attitude was always, they made the best studio model they could on a television budget in the 1960s. But when more money came along in the 70s for Phase 2, Planet of the Titans, and then eventually the movies, he built a better model closer to maybe his vision, whatever that might be. And his attitude was essentially, what you see on screen is always just a representation. It's an icon, it's an image, a graphic. So, even if you can say the TOS would have a hard time being retrofit into the TMP, fine, then just say the Enterprise always looked like this. Maybe they just swapped nacelles. Maybe he always intended the saucer and secondary hull and deflector to look like this. Who knows? Frankly, I think his attitude would eventually be, who cares? I'm not saying he couldn't nitpick, but, he was an inconsistent man at times on things like this anyway. It does seem like after the 60s, they really liked the idea of the swept back nacelles, because that's pretty much what we see going forward everywhere. Even later, Jeffrey's designs had them, so while maybe a little anachronistic here, I think it fits the spirit, if not the absolute kind of law of the design. Yeah. Same with the nacelles, having a little more patterning and a little bit of a flair to them. All that good stuff. In the end, I don't think it matters as long as the length part isn't factored. There's just no way a 442 meter ship would be refit into a 300 meter ship. That's not possible. But then again, technically the TOS ship couldn't be refit into the TMP ship. If you really want to get picky, you get into that whole ship of Theseus argument. Or you can just suspend your disbelief and enjoy things or not. To be fair, they considered giving this more of a Discovery look, kind of a visual reboot, if you will. Would you like it to have suffered the same fate as the Klingons? That could have happened. Well, with that, let's wrap things up. And let's end with a comparison with one of the Disco Fleet ships. And I picked the Varan, mostly just because I like it. It's one of my favorites. Ironically, because this ship really does fit in pretty well with previously Enterprise ships, Constitutions, it does stand out more with its contemporary Discovery era ships. They aren't really doing the secondary hull thing. They aren't doing the round nacelles. They do have a certain commonality in the deflector, although this does have the two-prong versus one, but they're doing more square nacelles. But they are doing angled pylons and other cues. And one could argue, I'm not saying it's correct, but an argument could be made that since these are very different purposes, that the Constitution is the outlier. After all, we don't know what other Starfleet ships would have looked like in the 70s or even 60s. We didn't get one until the Miranda and later the Oberth and the Excelsior in the 80s. So for all we know, the Constitution was the oddball. And if so, that's actually okay, because how many were designed for long-range independent 5-year missions? Probably not many. Probably most ships were designed for more mundane workaday purposes, which might require and need totally different technology for nacelles and deflectors and what have you. What I'm saying is maybe the Enterprise was unique. I mean, a lot of times in the original series, they claim this to be unique in the fleet and, one of 12 or one of 14 or whatever. Maybe that's closer to the truth than we thought. Maybe it's, maybe there's just very few ships like it because they don't need very many. That would also explain why it was considered such a prestigious vessel type to serve on. Who knows? In the end, hey, sorry, I keep moving it off accidentally. In the end, at least we didn't get more of these. We could have. It's funny too because I actually don't mind the other JJ ships. I don't mind the secondary ships or even the Kelvin. But I'm not a big fan of the Enterprise or its timeline there. At least this, they kept closer. So I'm tired, you're tired. Let's let this end. As always, if you could, please like, share, subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.